Hello, everybody. My book review is on Women, Gender, and Disaster, Global Issues and Initiatives by Elaine Anderson and PG Dar Chakrabarty. The thesis and the purpose of the book includes women's approach to emergency management with respect to emergency response, more of like a movement today in understanding women and the risk associated with women, and that their contributions in preparedness, mitigation, emergency, relief, sustainability, recovery are just indispensable. The introduction and background to the book deals with inequities in women that have carried over to the 21st century. It exists throughout different regions of the world, as we will see later, depicted in some of the research studies that I have selected for this PowerPoint. Also, the global genre is depicted in the urbanization of women as risk managers to use their leadership skills and natural capabilities to invoke and tap to their full potential in all phases of recovery process. The authors are well known and have published rich analysis of women's extraordinary achievements in this book. The work can be retrieved at Gender and Disaster Network for further research. The introduction and scope of this book are they vary in range in topic. Some of the topics covered is the relevance in women's rights and the women's biological factors such as menstruation, sanitation needs, pregnancy, breastfeeding needs, reproductive care for young women and young girls. And also there's the precaution that whenever these disasters occur, rape, sexual violence, and human trafficking happens even to young boys. So each culture, their gender issues and biases different. And I will be discussing more in the case studies, methodologies that were used in this book. But there's also mention of cultural inequality in pay, where, like, for example, in India, when someone dies, the monies go directly to the male household instead of going to the woman. And also another example is that even now they have cultural dowries where the women, all her wealth goes immediately to her married husband. So women have no right to ownership in some regions of this world. Some of the descriptions of research methods, case studies were taken from Asian tsunamis, the Kashmir earthquake, and of course Hurricane Katrina is the classical one. The gaps and implementations considered of emergency management were that women's knowledge and their skills, capabilities were not taken care of. Their knowledge of family nutrition really didn't matter to anybody. That is something that is valuable to a mother or a female, and their emotional caregivers to children, elderly, and those that they feel compassion for. But the major gap is that women are marginalized. But here are some of the images from the classic Katrina. In the middle, you can see the Superdome and the people, wanting the shelter. To the left, you see that destruction hits everybody all the same. And then there's a picture of a man cooking, and you can see how the sanitary conditions. And then, of course, you see the women to the right to the bottom right, in chaos. There's no order. People are just trying to get out. And then that picture on top right, it's really moving how you see the mother leading her children and also protecting her pet. Another one of the big case studies was taken from the Sri Lanka victims. Women were mostly killed, and so were the children. You can see some of the suffrage. And women were basically affected because they lived near the ocean in the villages. And so while the men were out working, most of the women had to endure all the suffering. And the reason why they died is because a lot of them didn't know how to swim. So swim has been taught to these communities, as part of survival. Description of research methods. In the case studies in the book, the emergency management responses were in Asia, Indonesia. They lacked bathrooms. People went unwashed for weeks, which affected their reproductive health. There was no special care for women. There were lots of miscarriages, premature births, and births were given in open air spaces. They were forced to use men's facilities, and these were very common of tsunami victimized areas. And in addition to that, the government is just not very aware of how to deal with women. In Sri Lanka, the women were harassed when they were publicly distributed the sanitary items. And in this slide also, we see the disaster recovery existing bias, which shows the gender bias of these examples that I just went over, which is the participation and the access and the rights to women are less represented in leadership decision-making at formal and public levels, as they are identified as primary givers of families. One of the quotes that has stayed with me is that violence against women is one disaster that men can prevent. I think that is very true. In the Honolulu Call to Action, which was a world conference held in Japan 2005. It was created to create women awareness and to educate the leadership in women and create involvement of women as we can, as we plan emergency management. But once again, research and study results from the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh showed the same results, that children, elderly, and women, endure the economic loss and long-lasting life changes. In 2006, the WHO and the CRED, the Center for Research and Epidemiology, did a research and found that the highest risk was 15 to 20, and those age groups died the most because they didn't know how to swim, as mentioned earlier in my presentation. The location of where they live is a factor, so their dwellings are a big factor in trying to mitigate these changes. The Dominican Republic, the women there designed, conducted interviews, drew map assessments, and redesigned with their strengths and dangers the new areas for relocation. And basically the major assumptions I found throughout the book were very forthcoming, and information related to emergency management, related to women's gender assessments in relation to other regions of the world. I agree with the assumptions that women are left out of important roles and should be included in such emergency planning when they are such great advocates for reducing disaster. I found the data to be very informative on the statistics of women and children who suffer the most in disasters from the cases presented. The book is actually very long, and I just tried to put whatever information I could to cover the main points of this book report. The field studies and questionnaires, interviews, and hands-on approach made the facts realistic of other reference literature as consistent and true. I enjoy the book. Thank you very much. But in my conclusion, I feel that the authors have done a great job in writing out the essential needs of women as an appendix to this book that covers all extreme care situations for women. I believe this book will help evolve women's role in planning of emergency management. The implementation message of emergency management policies to be included in women's role, to include their expertise, knowledge, and basically that is the message of this book.